Welcome back, Flyers nitty-gritty fans, to Getting Gritty with It with your host, Yariv, Wolok, and my special guest for the evening, first-time guest, the voice of the Lehigh Valley Phantoms, Bob Rotruck. Bob, thank you so much for joining. How are you?
I'm good. Yariv, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. And I've listened to you quite a bit, actually. Breakdown. So it's really nice to be looking at your face and getting to talk to you about the Phantoms. So it's cool.
I'm just the voice to most people most of the time, right? So yeah, put the face with a voice, I guess.
Well, for me, I've been a die-hard Flyers fan my whole life. It was always very difficult to watch the Phantoms. Now I actually have like the AHL package, so that's great. But it was awesome. I've got to interview Jim Jackson a couple times so far, and now I've gotten to you. Maybe next I'll get Tim Saunders. But you know what I mean? Like this is, it kind of puts all the puzzle pieces together. Like you're the tone of the team in a lot of ways.
I see the guys before they get there. I mean, that's kind of the point of our existence, or at least one of the points of our existence. And it's fun. I enjoy that. You see these guys that are going to be NHL players, and some of them are going to be all-stars or Hall of Famers, and you get to say you saw him when he was 19 or 20 before we knew for sure. We had a hunch maybe he could be pretty good, but we didn't know how good, and there's all this mystery surrounding him. And to say I saw him playing with the Phantoms, it's fun, and it's kind of an honor in a way to get to call the games of all of these guys when they're just getting their feet wet at the pro game. A guy like Cam York, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I have before I speak of the sponsor, I want to ask you a follow-up question on that. Is there any player or players in particular that you've watched throughout the years that you find yourself kind of still rooting for, whether they play for the team or not, just because of the, watching their path, kind of rising up through the system? They don't even have to be like the best players, right? It could be just guys that have great character that kind of put in the work.
Well, one guy that I'm going to continue to root for, who's now no longer with the Flyers, is Alex Lyon. And I just, he's such a good guy. And I thought he was, such a hard player. And I was there in that 5 overtime playoff game, calling every single one of his 94 saves in that epic night. And I went downstairs and congratulated him afterwards at like 1:30 in the morning or whatever. And, he was just laying on the floor, and he asked me, how many overtimes is that? 6 or 7? He had no idea. He was so dialed in, stop the puck. He had no idea. And first thing he said when he looked at me was, Bob, I can't do an interview now. And I'm like, I'm not coming to interview. I'm just congratulating the guys. That's all. Don't, relax. It's okay. But I thought it was incredible. He didn't know how many overtimes it was. And all he knew was, go back out, and okay, he was on that side last time, right? So now he's got to be on this side. And that's all he knew. So Alex Lyon would be a guy. And then, some of the guys that have since gone over to Europe, and a guy like TJ Brennan, who was always really good to me.
Hometown
and,
hero.
Guys like, I see Taylor Lear is going over to Germany as well.
Oh,
and
cool.
He's sort of similar to Alex Lyon in some ways, just a good guy and an easy guy to root for. And then you go even further back to early Lehigh Valley guys or Adirondack guys that played some for the Flyers, and a guy like Jason Atkinson, who I think is teammates with Taylor Lear this year in Germany on Wolfsburg or whatever their team is. I'm going to have to look it up. So I root for them, but obviously I'm not keeping that, that tied in with what they're doing. And I don't know. I mean, off the top of my head, there are just so many guys, and obviously some of them have moved on and have retired or moved into coaching. Yep. The head coach of the Toronto Marlies is a guy named Greg Moore, who they got in a trade for Tom Sestito, or they traded him for Tom Sestito eventually. That was my first year in Adirondack, and he was a good guy, and now he's the head coach with the Toronto Marlies. So there are a lot of them, really, and a lot of them have since retired and kind of moved on. Some of the guys that Flyers fans might not be as familiar with, who never really made a big splash and were just AHL guys. And one other guy that I'm really happy for, I'm holding this pen here, is Stephen Swaively, who was an AHL and ECHL contract guy and from Reading. And I'm happy for his success because they added him to the television broadcasts on Service Electric. And I heard about that a couple weeks. Yeah. So a couple weeks before our first game last season, I'd heard that Swaively was joining, and so I included his email address on the game notes that I send out before each game. And so seeing him up in the press box, and I've known him for 4 years, going out there and competing and working for his role on the team as a fourth line guy. In Reading, he's a top line guy, one of the best ECHL players and one of the best faceoff guys. And with the Phantoms, he knows what he is. He's a fourth line guy. Who works hard and is also good on the faceoffs, and a good guy overall. And it's fun getting to see him again regularly now, moving on into his new role. And I've seen so many announcers as well. A guy like Brian Boucher, who came down to the Adirondack Phantoms, and he did TV for Service Electric before he went to Philly, and now on to NBC. And I mean, you kind of knew back then.
He's very good.
If he wants to pursue this, there's some real potential, because he's a smart guy, and he talks well and really understands the game, and the players respect him. You can tell that in the interviews he conducts. So you asked a pretty open-ended question. I think I threw 10 guys out there, and I know that I'm forgetting like 50 others, right?
Sure.
There's so many guys.
No, that's awesome, and I agree with you. Boucher, to me, as soon as I heard him kind of make that jump, I'm like, okay, if this is like this is like an elite athlete at broadcasting. You kind of notice it early, like you got that with Jonesy too. Guy's just really comfortable in front of the camera. But Boucher immediately, like, I'm not surprised that he was stolen by national television at all.
Right.
He's charming, he was articulate, the whole thing. Accurate.
Yeah, he mostly ended his career, or at least his North American career, with us in Adirondack. He came over from the Hurricanes and came down from the Flyers, and had a great attitude. I mean, here's a guy who's had a really long and successful NHL career. He's getting sent down to the AHL in the twilight of his career, and I don't know how old he was, 33 or 34, maybe. I'm just guessing. Yeah, when he came to us, but that's tough. Nobody wants to get sent down to the AHL or be a third goalie. And he came down and had such a good attitude. And then I want to say it was the next year, and it was our last year with Adirondack. So we hadn't moved to Allentown yet, but Service Electric was doing television for the games that we played at Hershey and Wilkes-Barre. And they brought in Boucher to help on the broadcast, and to see if he would want to do it full time the next year. And so he did maybe 5 or 6 games that year, because we went to Hershey 3 times and Wilkes-Barre twice, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they were the TV broadcasts with the people that I still know, like Steve Dagler and Christy Fulkerson. And then the next year he did the whole season, all of the home games, and he's commuting over. And this is the 2014-15 season, which was the inaugural year of Lehigh Valley. And he would show up early, and he took it so seriously. And the notes that he had prepared, I think a lot of former athletes kind of show up and go into the booth. I mean, not everyone, but some of them think, well, I know the game and I got a roster here, so I can just look at the players' names and I can talk. And for a lot of guys, that's enough, and they can be fine with that. Bouch was so prepared and took these games for the Phantoms in the AHL, these TV broadcasts, so seriously, and had index cards for each guy. And I'm looking at his prep work going, that's more than I did for this game. He was really on top of it, and already was really knowledgeable. So what you see with his performance and his success on the network level, it's not just because he's a natural. It's because he's dedicated and does all the work, does the preparation to know what he's talking about before the game. And I know that this is a different sore topic for some, but a guy that I also saw doing that when I went to some Stanley Cup games as a media member, this is over 10 years ago. But Pierre Maguire would do that. People think he knows his stuff off the top of his head. He's sitting there. It's 2:00 before game one. It's Pittsburgh against Detroit. He's seen both teams a zillion times, and he's sitting there, doing all this prep work before the game, and really focused and dialed in. And I talked with him once before a Flyers game as well, when I went down for a morning skate and was chatting with him, and I met him and Mike Emmerich. And I mean, he's just hitting me with questions on Robert Haig, who had recently gone up to the Flyers, wants to know, how he's looking, and I know that Pierre is a divisive topic for some people, but that always impressed me, because the guy cares and had passion, and still does, and wanted to know. I mean, he's just talking hockey all the time. So some of that behind the scenes stuff with how involved and engaged he is, that I don't think fans and some of those that dislike him that they don't see. I looked at Pierre Maguire in a new light out of that as well. I'm just sort of remembering some of that when I'm talking about Brian Boucher and all the preparation that he did. It just phenomenal. I'm really happy for him and for his success. A different guy that maybe, that you would remember that our fans probably don't know about at all would be Bruno Gervais.
Of course.
And he's doing TV in Laval and Montreal. He does some studio stuff. He does color commentary on the TV broadcasts in Laval, obviously in French. And so when we would play in Laval, they don't televise all of their home games, but it's worked out that it's, I've seen him back-to-back years when we went up there, maybe 3 years in a row, and just chatting and talking about a good attitude when he was sent down to Adirondack. That guy was as positive as could be. And I'm kind of looking at him the first day he showed up, because some guys are a little grumbly when they get sent down to the NHL. And they got to hike all the way up to Glens Falls, and, you're not in the major league arena anymore. And I'm like, look, he's smiling and has such a great attitude. I'm like, does he know that he was sent down? Like, does he, is he aware he was demoted? He's like such a happy guy. But, and so that's a different guy who's doing broadcasting stuff up in Quebec and in Montreal, some studio stuff, and also in the booth as a color commentator. And I have no idea how good he is because I don't speak French, so I can't even follow his broadcast, but I know that he's really passionate about what he does, and he prepares a lot as well. He took me out to lunch because he wanted to find out what was up with the Phantoms and pick my brain about Carter Hart and Phil Myers and guys that we had then. Really, really good guy. So that's another guy that I root for, that I'm happy for his success too.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting what you're saying, because I talk about it all the time, specifically to hockey too, is that a lot of guys come in with a lot of talent, but it's always the preparation, the work, right? It's your character kind of is reflected throughout your career, whether you're doing broadcasting or you're playing hockey or whatever it is that you're doing. It's like a lot, if you really want to be the best at is what you're doing, even in playing hockey, they put in the work. Like a guy like Ovechkin puts in the work, a guy like Giroux, like these guys also practice hardest. Like I've heard that about Crosby, about Giroux. It's just because they're ultra competitive, and you got to think about Boucher. Like he saw that, and he's like, "I'm gonna win at this." It's like that type of attitude. And I like what you said about.
I don't know what his agent was telling him. Like if his agent was saying, like, "Hey, if you do the work here with Service Electric, you might have a chance to be a network announcer someday, or maybe work with the Flyers or an NHL team." I don't know what anyone was telling him about any of this, but you got to prepare, or if he just did that on his own. I know that he leaned on Steve Dagler, who's a longtime play-by-play guy with the Phantoms and with a lot of other teams. And he kind of guided him, but work ethic for some of these guys. We had a game last year. And geez, I'm trying to think what date it was, but I was there for morning skate, and I was doing some work up in my booth because that's kind of doubles as my office sometimes. So I turn on the space heater and get out my laptop and stuff. And the practice hadn't started yet. And sometimes there's a guy that goes out on the ice early to shoot around, and so forth. And I want to say it was after his 900th point that Cal O'Reilly, and we came back. That might not have been it, but it was somewhere. It wasn't that day, but it was whatever. It was 34-year-old veteran captain Cal O'Reilly, first one out on the ice, skating. And nobody else was out there for 5 minutes, and we had some injured guys who could have used a little extra stretching or whatever. He's the guy, and he's not doing this to try to lead or guide the other guys, because I don't even know who else saw him but me. I'm the only one out there. The only others who would have known he was the first one out there would have been like, I think Isaac Ratcliffe was the second one out there, and he would have gotten out there and gone, "Oh, well, Cal's already here." Like he can mail it in, and he can still perform. He doesn't have to be the first one out there firing the puck around or skating and getting his legs going. I mean, he's got to work to be able to keep up because he's a little older. Sure. That just impressed me. It was it might have been one of the first days back after our COVID layoff. But to see Cal O'Reilly at 34, not a 20-year-old rookie, the veteran who has, some of the most NHL games and most pro games of any one of our guys, he's the one that's going out there the most. The guy that's played the most and has already been there, done that, who could be maybe the one guy who could afford to mail it in.
Sure.
And he didn't. And I without that specific example, and guys probably not seeing him, you know that that's the kind of character that and presence that he brings about himself on the ice, on the bench, and in the room. That's not just a one-time thing. That's how he is always, and that's where you hear these other guys like a Tyson Forrester talking about how they're learning from the pros, and they learn just watching a guy like Cal O'Reilly.
Yeah.
And now, well, there is some work ethic involved, and it's not about grumbling, oh, I got to hit the weight room. This is what we got to do. This is part of our day, and you'll learn from those guys. And and so then it gets kind of handed off to the next wave of talent, right? You know, yeah. So anyway, you mentioned work ethic, and I thought of that. I wish I could remember what date that was. I tweeted about it because I was just like, I can't believe this. You know, Cal O'Reilly,
maybe
first one out. No insult to Cal, but it's just you don't normally expect that all the time.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think about Lou Lamoriello a lot because I feel like he's very misunderstood by fans, but is one of those guys who just incredible attention to detail type of person. It kind of trickles down to the organization immediately. And I personally love that stuff. So, you know, I'm not surprised about Cal O'Reilly. When you see a guy who is captain playing in his, like, again, a lot of those guys kind of fade off into, you know, other leagues or they go overseas, but to be captain of an AHL squad with a bunch of talented young players on there, you know, he takes it seriously. It's obvious, you know, why he's like kind of a swing guy to the NHL.
It's not an accident because there are a ton of veterans out there who are looking for AHL contracts who are not getting them because there's only so many to go around.
Right, exactly.
So for that type of faith and confidence in a guy like Cal, you know, he beat out 10 other veterans for this position, and it doesn't necessarily matter that, okay, he's got all these games and all these points. A lot of guys have a lot of games and points that are going to be closest to what Cal has put up. They're not getting the gigs. And it's not even necessarily a fault of their own. It's more just a compliment to Cal and what he does and is able to do for those guys in the room. And a lot of people would say the same things about Colin Mcdonald in his 4 years with the Phantom serving as the captain here. Yeah. It's so important. And it's not like, well, he's a veteran, so obviously he's going to get a job. A lot of Flyers fans, I don't think, realize how hard it is for veterans to get gigs in the AHL because we have a veteran rule for how many veterans you're allowed to have in the lineup. So that's one part. And then secondly, it's just, well, we need to make room for our prospects. So some of these veteran guys who are absolutely good enough to play in the AHL, and we know that because they have before, but Taylor Lear is going over to Europe because getting an AHL opportunity might, you know, he could stay here and maybe eventually land one, but it's not happening for him right away. And Europe came calling and they offered him a salary, and, you know, TJ Brennan and Jason Atkinson and all these other guys that end up, you know, and over to England as well. You know, that's where Jay Rosehill eventually would end up playing for several years after he was with the Flyers and the Phantoms. So they're talented, but it's just there's not room for that many veteran guys because we've got so many young guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's one of those things where you're hiring these guys for their character, hoping that it kind of spreads to the other guys. 100%.
Right. If you're showing up and just scoring and you know, if you're known to have character issues, then it's definitely tougher to land 100%. A gig, even if it's your rep or whatever, you know. But you want somebody who's going to be a captain or an alternate captain. And Nate Prosser was terrific too in his time with us. And you want to talk about guys with the work ethic. You know, this is a guy that's undrafted and was not necessarily projected to ever be an NHL player. He certainly made a career for himself out of Colorado College, and, you know, a terrific leader in the room. And you know, you get a sense, I didn't know him when he was younger, but you get a sense that that's kind of the guy that he was when he was
most likely
23 instead of 33. You know, I mean, guys changed 100%. Some, but not that much.
No, 100%. Actually, I have a somewhat of a relationship with Riley Cote, and I've interviewed him. I have another segment that I do podcast-wise. We talked about it, like his career. I mean, there's a reason he was offered a coaching job with the Phantoms. I was like, you know, he was never the most talented player from like a point scoring, but he had this incredible work ethic to kind of pivot whatever it is he was doing in life and kind of find a solution. And he was incredibly hardworking. And you look at what he does today with Body Check Wellness and how he takes care of his body and how he's trying to take care of other people's bodies. Like, this is a guy who's just very detail oriented and hardworking. It's like they immediately said, well, and why don't you be coach?
Yeah. Yes. And Riley's a great example because, he's a guy that, on his face was probably never supposed to make it to the NHL.
Right.
And he'll be the first one to tell you
even say that. Yeah.
Like 1 goal in 149 games or whatever the heck it was. Like, he started in the Central Hockey League with the Memphis River Kings. And I was actually there for 1 month before the River Kings said, we don't like me. They didn't like me as an announcer. So they got rid of me. I remember Riley sort of, just because he fought a couple times. We barely met then. And then obviously I worked with him as an assistant coach with the Phantoms for a very long time.
Sure.
But, he's a guy that made the most of what he had, and not just the work ethic, but also the positivity, because he's going to be a scratch, or he's going to have those games where he's going to be on the ice for 4 minutes of ice time. And maybe he gets into a fight, or maybe he doesn't, okay, are you going to pout about it? Or are you going to stay positive? Because the other players, are feeding off that positive energy that Riley brings to the table all the time. And that's why he was really, well respected as an assistant coach, and why he was thought of as being a future assistant coach at just 27 years old.
Yeah.
When he started as an assistant
super
coach
young.
Adirondack Phantoms. That's incredibly young.
Super young.
That's really unusual. And he thrived in that position. That's a terrific example of a guy with the work ethic and the positive attitude that he brought to the room, making the most of a career that otherwise, he probably would not have gotten to the NHL, or certainly wouldn't have lasted in the NHL as long as he did, without some of those other qualities that he brought to the team.
Yeah. And honestly, I want to circle back to, you mentioned Alex Lyon. I personally, I think he still has an opportunity to be an NHL backup. That's always kind of how I saw him. Yes. And I still think he's going to chase that. And I think he probably will get a chance, especially as he gets closer to 30. But that is a guy just intellect wise, his ability to communicate. That's a guy I could definitely see being hired by a team beyond playing 100%.
I don't know what his aspirations are for after his playing career. I think a lot of guys, don't want to think about it because they're dialed in to being the best player they can be.
Sure.
And I agree with you. I think that Carolina picked him up as, their third goalie and their opportunity. They made so many, interesting, goalie switches there, get rid of Nedeljkovic and bring in Lyon, and so I'm not exactly sure what all was going on there. I assume that he, because they brought in Frederick Anderson also. And I assume that Alex starts with the Chicago Wolves to, assuming everyone is healthy
as well.
And that's the Carolina affiliate now. It's not Charlotte anymore, but it's up with the Chicago Wolves. But he talked about proving it to himself, and he didn't just say this during interviews, but he would say this in private conversations to me. A couple of those NHL games, it didn't go so great for him. They rattled him a little bit, I think, and he needed to get back up there and prove it to himself, which he did at the end of last season. Yes. And there were a couple of games that he had with the Flyers, and I saw him, get kind of scrambly and out of position and some, a little panicky there. And I'm looking at some of these games and I'm going, that's not the Alex Lyon that I know. I don't see him doing that with the Phantoms. I felt like he got, a little,
look at the way the Flyers play defense
a little bit because, he's aware of who he's facing or whatever that mental block was. And once he got in a couple of games and settled himself, there's a different game and he made some comment that kind of ended up blowing up Twitter about, not in the right headspace because he came in and, in relief, I think.
Okay.
And a lot of people jumped all over that comment. And I'm like, right. And I'm like, the fact is that happens
all the time.
And you can either have a player that gives you the cliches and doesn't really tell you what's going on, or you can have a guy that's honest.
Yeah.
And tells you, I'm not sure I was in the right headspace there. Well, guess what? Guys can't be at their A game or 100% every single time. It's not possible. You can try to find consistency. You can try to, grind out wins when maybe it's not your A game. Goaltending works, it's so fast, and you see a 3-on-1, you see him coming at you and, you're adjusting. And I mean, a couple inches off on your positioning, that's a huge hole in the corner that's behind you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be pretty close to perfect a lot of times.
And not just that. I mean, just to add to what you're saying, the Flyers did not play a very consistent defense in front of any goaltender.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So it's not even
everyone.
Yeah. And here's the thing: is Alex going to be saying, "Well, my D let me down"? You know, he's putting it on himself.
Definitely.
And everyone's jumping all over him and saying, you know, well, you know, what an excuse maker. You know, stop.
Look,
the guy is saying that he had a bad game. He's pointing the finger at himself. He's saying he's got to be better next time. You know, it's you know,
Twitter
I saw
is
some
not an easy place.
Well, if I'm video, I bench him and throw him in the doghouse and call up somebody else. Like, no, just stop. You know, like it's not. Yeah. That's you know, it happens to all these guys, but not everyone is as open about it. But I guarantee you that, you know, it's happened to other players in that Flyers room, and they're just 100%. Not saying, well, I don't know if I would. And anyway, that also gets into Alex's personality and mentality a little bit.
Yeah.
And because he'll talk about it the other way as well, you know, and it sounds a little, you know, Zen type, you know,
sure.
meditative and all of these things that are maybe a little bit beyond my knowledge and experience, but, you know, he'll say it the other way too. You know, well, I really felt like I was in the right headspace going into this game, and I'm trying to find that and, you know, hang on to it and, you know, stay dialed in. So he talks about being in the right headspace. He was in the wrong headspace, and I can't even remember all the details, but I remember that he, you know, he really drew some attention. You know, the Flyers were out of the playoff hunt then anyway, so, you know, just relax, everyone. Anyway, I do root for him a ton, and I'm going to be kind of following how he does with the Chicago Wolves. And I think it's interesting too, because, you know, he's been with the Flyers for so long. Now this is a new situation and a fresh start for him. And, you know, I think he was doing pretty well with what he had going here. I don't think he's fulfilled on the NHL potential that he wanted to. And I feel like, you know, for a lot of the guys too, Gostisbehere as well, you know, a fresh and Phil Myers a little bit too, you know, a fresh start. It wouldn't surprise me if all of those guys did well. And if they do,
100%.
That's not a reflection on how, you know, Chuck Fletcher was wrong to deal them. Chuck will be happy for them because you get to know these guys and you're rooting for them. And when you're, you know, now sending Ghost out the door, you are wishing him well. And you're 100%. Hoping that he thrives and succeeds.
I think he
with
will.
His next team. I'm not rooting against a guy like Ghost. I'm certainly not rooting against a guy like Phil Myers, who I think is a great person, and you know,
I think he'll excel in Nashville.
So dynamic and has such. I mean, he has so much potential that kind of got turned a little sideways last year. Sometimes it just takes a different voice.
I mean, again, what I say to people, I go, when you see the entire team doing it, how are you picking on one guy? You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Like, give me a break. Let me do this real quick because I don't want to stop us later. But just a shout out to our sponsor, Jim Steaks on South. Make sure to check out Jim Steaks. Buy their cheesesteaks. They love the Flyers, so make sure to check them out. All right, let's get past that. All right, let's get into.
I mean, you want to talk about blame? You want to talk about blaming one guy? You know,
sure.
What are the Phillies doing now? You know, Gabe Kapler, and he's horrible, and we got to get rid of him. Well, guess what? You got a new manager. You got a bit of a new bullpen too. The Phillies are still all over the place. Yeah. You know, was it Gabe Kapler's fault? He's on the verge of being manager of the year in San Francisco, and I don't think he's that different there than what he was with the Phils. You know, it's none of it almost at any time is going to be one guy, but, you know, and you look at what Chuck Fletcher did. My goodness. I mean, there was such a long stretch of why isn't Chuck making moves? This team was so, you know, disappointing. And I can't believe he has, you know, we haven't even had the draft yet, you know, much less the expansion draft for Seattle.
He killed it.
Right. Awesome. And then everything went from nothing, everything's quiet, and he's explaining it, and he's honest. You can tell that he's an honest guy.
Yes, he is.
He's like, well, it's pretty quiet out there, and everyone's kind of, you know, holding steady and playing their cards a little close. I don't think, you know, it's not really happening yet. You know, he tells everyone what's happening, literally.
Yeah.
And then obviously, then it was just boom, 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 one move after another, after another, after another, and then all the Flyers fans were like, you know, whoa, too much, too fast. You know, you wanted moves, you got moves, and I think everyone is really, really excited about what he pulled off here. Hang on, I gotta turn my phone off. Okay, sorry.
No worries. No, I think he's had an exceptional offseason. So actually, let's start with the changes at coaching. because we had different coaches, and I really like Scott Gordon. I think it was more contractual that was an issue more than anything. But now, longtime Flyer and assistant coach for the Flyers, Ian LaPerriere, takes over. Riley Armstrong, who has relationship with the team from back in the day, and then Jason Smith, who played for the team for a brief stint, but I actually really enjoyed watching the Gator back in the day. A very physically dominating player. Again, I think it goes back to that character thing we were talking about. What do you think about the coaching changes? How do you think that that'll affect this group? Have you had a chance to talk to any of them one-on-one at this point?
Well, I've talked with Lappy a little bit, but not too much. And I haven't talked with Jason or Riley Armstrong at all. Not at all. Okay. And I've met him. Like I texted Jason Smith a couple of times, and that was it. So that'll come. I think they're busy with some other things. It's fine. But one thing I think is don't mess with our coaches. These guys put up a fair number of penalty minutes back in the day. Lappy, how many times did he break his nose when he was a player? Like 10 times or something?
Still not.
And beyond just the, he blocked shots with his face that all the Flyers fans know. Before that, with the LA Kings and with Colorado and not even the biggest guy, but and you want to talk about sort of some similarities as well with Riley Cote here, where you're talking about. Lappy goes in there and just exudes this positivity. When he was a player too, back when he had hair. I mean, that's what he brings. And that's what other players are talking about. And there was one podcast, I don't even know if it was yours or somebody else's, but it was with Mason Millman. Okay. And he was talking about, was it this yours? I don't even know. I can't remember. But
I wish I had him on.
No. Okay. Well, anyway, he talks about, you show up at 8 a.m. for a morning skate, and Lappy, he's already been there since 6 and has already done his workout.
It seems like a Brindamore situation, no? Like something similar to Rod Brindamore, like a guy who leads by example, like literally is still in good shape, runs marathons.
Well, there's that, thing. Yes. I mean, I think Brindamore's personality is a bit different than Lappy's, but but he's just Lappy's all friendly and hey, how you doing? We're gonna have a great day, and and just really, you get the guys looking forward to practice, which is not necessarily easy to do. I mean, it's, some guys embrace it, but it's not necessarily fun, but it's a process that you've got to embrace, because if you don't, you're going to get killed in the game. Everyone loves the games, but if you don't practice well, the games are not going to go well for you, usually. So I was really interested on the assistant coach decisions, because I didn't know or hear any rumblings about either of those guys. So I think I assume that Lappy was involved in that quite a bit and talked with those guys and wanted to see how they mesh philosophically and just personalities as well. You want to be able to, for the coaches to be on the same page and to get along well. And Lappy's got some ideas. I mean, just very briefly chatting with him, he was already developing ideas when we were introducing him at the press conference at PPL Center, and he's walking around in the locker rooms downstairs, and already some ideas on what he wants to do with the team. And here's the thing: he knows he's going to make mistakes. He's new to the AHL. He's practically never been here except for a couple of games, 15 years ago or 20 years ago now, whatever. So he knows that he's got a steep learning curve. So he's watching a lot of video of AHL games, learning who some of these other teams and players are, learning our guys. And I think he's the kind of guy, in some ways similar to Alain Vigneault, who obviously he's worked with and learned from, where he can go and realize he doesn't have to do it all himself. He can, delve some of the responsibilities and the ideas and philosophies and the brainstorming with some of the other coaches. Okay, this is not working on our breakout. What are we going to do on how to adjust it? It doesn't have to be all him on every idea. And so I think there will be a growing process and a learning curve, but I also anticipate that he's going to hit a home run. And I think he's got the team to do that with as well. So I'm really excited for it. He just, exudes this kind of positive attitude that it's infectious, it's contagious
With
with everyone that he's around, not just players, but guys like me, the broadcaster, and so forth. It's just he's well known for this. He's a really good guy. And look, I know Flyers fans saying, well, that's great, that's nice. Should that mean that he's the head coach? Well, in some ways, yes, at least part way. But here's a guy that they've had the faith in as an assistant coach through all these different head coaching regimes with the Flyers, and all of these different things changing there. There's a reason why Lappy has stuck around.
Yep.
For all of these different eras, from Laviolette, Berube, Hackstall, Gordon, Vigneault, all these guys that only knew, like, oh yeah, he was a tough guy as a player, don't know much about him. And from Ron Hextall over to Chuck Fletcher too. Yes. They don't have to have loyalty to the guy that had been there, and worked into development and into an assistant coach 10 years ago when, he was more or less forced to retire because of different health issues. But I mean, look, you've got, and Ron Hextall and Chuck Fletcher are different GMs, and they both appreciated and respected the ideas and the passion that Lappy brought to the table. I think that, and
also putting him around kids.
I think he has been ready for it for a little while, but I definitely think he's ready for it now.
100%. But I think, to your point, I think it's also why they're putting him as head coach of the Phantoms specifically. I mean, they recognize they have a bunch of younger players. He usually leads a lot of the player development early on, right, and runs those camps. This is a guy who's very used to being, I don't want to say like the good cop or whatever, but he's good at building relationships with these guys and preparing them for what's to come. And I think you add a guy like Jason Smith, who's got the snarl, has already been a head coach elsewhere, has nothing but leadership all through. I don't know Riley Armstrong as well, but I assume picked for similar reasons. Like, they're really trying to groom something there, like certain attitude and then a certain level of expectation for conditioning, I think, are two things they're trying to walk away. They want to be the most conditioned team in the NHL, or at least one of the most conditioned teams in the NHL, which, quite frankly, I think is at the root of winning a championship. I don't think you win a championship unless you're in the best shape.
Sure. But I'll say this, though. I'm not so sure that there was a real problem with conditioning before. I felt like our team was in pretty good shape last season, the season before. At least that was
the Phantom.
That was my impression. Yes. Well, yeah, the Phantoms. And but yes, I mean, maybe this takes it to the next level, and that's one thing that Lappy says, kind of one of the first things he'll kind of throw out there at you in an interview, like, these guys are going to be in shape, and there's no discussion about it. You're either in shape or you're not playing. This is how it is going to be. I mean, the guy runs triathlons and all that. Like,
exactly. Lead by example.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you and look, if you're a 20-year-old player, you better be able to compete and be in better shape than your 47-year-old head coach. I mean, I know he's a former NHLer. He's a 47-year-old head coach. And frankly, I think he could probably,
No, I think that makes a big difference.
More than some of his players. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that.
100%. I totally think that's part of it. And I've even heard the Hurricanes players, like in interviews, talk about that. They're like, it's the one thing about playing for Rod Brindamore is like, you can't come to camp out of shape or even partially. Like, your head coach is in the best shape of everybody at camp, and he's like 50 years old. It's like, it's almost embarrassing. I think that's kind of important, though. It's just a level of standard. And again, to that point as well, what you were trying to say about not being out of condition, Scott Gordon wasn't fired, right? Like, it's not like they said, hey, you did a bad job. I think it was an issue where they wanted, they had just a difference on how long they were going to give him a contract for. And I think Gordon's like, I'm an experienced coach. I'm going to go get a better contract somewhere else. And I think it was simply a business transaction, at least from what I could tell.
Well, I think they wanted to look at a different voice.
Okay.
In there and some different ideas. And I think, I think Scott Gordon wanted a different, change of scenery as well. I think
mutual. That's all I was going to say. It seemed mutual to me more than, hey, like, I'm really hanging on this job. And they're like, no, you're not, you're not up to the standard here. It seemed more of just like, maybe this isn't working moving forward. Like, that's how it kind of felt to me.
Oh, yeah, a little bit. I mean, what they're saying behind closed doors is, kind of behind closed doors, right?
Fair enough. All right, well, let's move on to the players. Let's get down to some of the fun stuff. I want to bring up some of the younger guys, guys that you've seen, and what your expectations of them this year. And one guy I want to start off with because he's been coming up a lot lately. Having said that, I brought him up way before everybody else because I always knew he was going to take a long time. Typically big players do take longer. I think it's a misconception of fans that they assume that because they're big, they're going to make the NHL faster. I think it's the opposite. They have to grow into their body. And a guy like Isaac Ratcliffe is a guy who's had, I don't want to say stagnated progress, right? But he obviously had all those injuries last year. He didn't set the world on fire statistically, like Morgan Frost coming in. I didn't expect that. But having said that, there's obviously he looked good at Dev Camp. I do expect a very big season from him. I expect him to take a bigger leadership role and to probably produce a lot more, now, especially now that he's healthy. But he does seem like a guy, maybe not a call-up, potentially at some point, maybe during the year, but a guy who probably is a year away from being taken seriously for an NHL role. What do you think about
I'm waiting for Isaac. I'm waiting for Isaac to get there.
Yeah.
Last season was, a disappointment in some ways. Even when, at one point we thought he was healthy, he wasn't. I don't think he was all the way.
Right.
He gets his fractured rib and punctured lung thing on New Year's Eve shortly before our season starts. And so he's trying to get back into strength from that. And then he gets COVID. And somewhere in there, like there were a couple of times I'm looking at him looking winded coming over to the bench.
Yep.
During games. And I wasn't the only one noticing this. I didn't ask him about it, but he didn't look like he was all the way back. And I didn't know at that time that he was one of the players that had COVID. But now I sort of suspected, but now it's out there. And he did. And so I think that was affecting him as well later on. And, the injury that he had before the season was horrendous. He was getting there. And that's a guy that Scott Gordon believes in too. Like he'll say he's going to be an NHL player. And I think so as well. Gordo wouldn't really, step out on a limb for every guy all the time just for kicks.
Sure.
But there's a real character there with Isaac Ratcliffe. There's, that composure and that inner strength that he has. He's a good person and a good personality. And you talk about working hard and so forth. And this is a guy that, what was it, 2-3 years ago in major juniors, put up 67 goals in a year, 50 goals in the regular season, and then 17 more in the playoffs and the Memorial Cup. I mean, he was phenomenal. He's not going to be, a 67 goal scorer or even a 30 goal scorer in the NHL, but the guy can play. And he would also joke about, like he's got to put on weight. And he would joke about, I've done enough growing this way.
Right.
I need to grow more this way. And that would be like one of his first jokes.
The hardest part.
And he's trying to put on some of the muscle. He needs it because, he's 6'6" or 6'7", whatever he is. And I mean, if you're going to be that big, you better be able to take a hit and, maybe deal one every once in a while, which he did a couple of times last year.
It's going to be a target.
I don't want to step out on a limb here and say I'm looking forward to a big season out of him, but I wouldn't be surprised if we can get it, especially if he's 100% healthy. There's a reason why the Flyers, are hanging on to him, and they still see the potential there. Like I think we all do, not
Sure.
just from major juniors, but on top of the different reasons why last season was a little bit off for him. The year before, which was his full rookie season, he was the most improved guy.
Yeah, by the end of the
from
year.
opening night until March 11th, which was our last game before we had the suspension and cancellation. He was the most improved player. And he was up to maybe 6 goals by then, I think.
Yeah. But they all came in the second half of the season, from what I recall. Like he didn't have any points.
He had like 1 goal in the first 25 or 30 games. That's right.
Yeah.
And then he started to, find his confidence and his, get into his element a little bit more. It's just, I thought he was going to produce more last year, but I also, I knew the fractured rib stuff. I don't think I really fully understood everything he was going through. And on top of that, even without the COVID, the weird interruptions that we had through our season, anybody who had issues with the development in their game, and Ratcliffe maybe qualifies a little bit.
Sure.
It's not an excuse. It's a reason why. I mean, it really is difficult to go, even without COVID, it's difficult to go away from the arena for 2 weeks without skating. Then you come back, have one practice, and play a game.
Yeah.
Guys, some guys handle it okay, and other guys are not quite ready for that. I mean, you never go 2 weeks without skating, period. But they weren't allowed to go to the arena during the COVID layoff stuff there. And there was one COVID layoff, and we came back out, and we played Hershey on a Wednesday night, and got the doors blown off, 6-1 loss. And Hershey knew, like, this is not the Phantoms team that we saw earlier in the year that was beating us. And the only losses they took on their home ice were against the Phantoms for Hershey, because they were a very good team. They knew. And I was talking with their radio guy, and they're like, yeah, this wasn't the Phantoms. This wasn't even fair, because they were put in that position. I mean, I got to get back into the games eventually. But it's a team that hadn't practiced for a week and a half. And so Ratcliffe was dealing with some of that. Felix Sandstrom had a lot of that too, where his play was so sporadic to begin. And once he finally got to practice a little bit and play some games, it turned into a pretty decent ending for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But and then it went a little bit the opposite way for Zayd Wisdom, who started off great and then had a little bit of a fade off at the end. And I really feel like the layoff impacted him, because the first 3 or 4 games back, I think it was, you looked at Wisdom and you're going, this is not the same. He's not the same at all as what he was before. I hope we can get back. He was phenomenal, and all the energy, not just the goals that he scored, but the energy and block shots and making smart plays, and you could tell he wasn't all the way there. And other guys, the other teams that were playing, they're continuing to play, and they're continuing to improve, and they're gaining momentum, because a team in the middle of the season is better than they are at the beginning of the year.
Absolutely.
At the beginning of the year, you got all the rough patch. It's not the same, at the middle of the season. At the first game of the year, you come out of that and you go, okay, we got a lot to work on. Every single team does that. Like, okay, it was a good start, but this is not, you can't throw a team into the middle of the season, who's going to be playing like their early season conditioning and more or less intelligence too. But anyway, I think that Ratcliffe could have a big season. I certainly hope so. And I think that there is still a bright future for him. You see, I saw flashes of it last year, and I kept on waiting for it to happen last season, and it sort of didn't in some ways, with just, a few exceptions in there. I think he's going to be better this year. And I agree with you. I think that by the end of the season, or maybe next year, depending on how things go, he could be knocking on the door for an NHL position.
Yeah, I think
that was a really long-winded answer about one guy.
No, it's great.
I got a lot of thoughts that are kind of convoluted in my head on Ratcliffe. Yeah,
it's all good. You mentioned a few guys in there. Actually, I think that was great, and agreed with you. I think it's going to be a process with him, and I think this is the first time people are going to see why he was drafted so high.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to another guy who actually missed a lot of times due to injury, but I think you got a good look at him at least prior to the injury, and that's Morgan Frost. Now, this is a guy who's been penciled in as a third-line center option. Who knows what's going to happen at this point with the Flyers' depth, veteran depth, but he's immensely skilled. I personally think he was kind of knocking on the door anyway, and the way the Flyers were playing last year, if he didn't get injured, he would have played much more in the lineup, in my opinion. Just because they weren't playing very good as a team or producing. The power play obviously wasn't doing that well. So this is a guy I believe the Flyers would like to see in their lineup at some point during this year. He did miss a bunch of time, so he's going to have to work through that. What do you think about Frost? Where do you think he is? Have you seen him play at all? You talked to him, anything like that?
No, I haven't talked to him recently. Okay. No, but one, good character guy again. I mean, a lot of hockey guys are, but Frosty is a good kid, plain and simple. Really nice guy, and obviously an ultra talented guy. I'm not sure that he's not 100% yet, by his own admission. I think that kind of caught everyone by by surprise a little bit. Okay, he had his shoulder surgery back in February or whatever it was, and now he's in camp, so obviously he's good. And now, he's talking with reporters about, well, I think I still have a little more rehabbing to go, and hopefully I can get it to 100% soon. It's not a big leap to figure out, well, he still feels it, or he doesn't think he has all the strength there. And based on that alone, I don't know if he makes the Flyers opening night roster. I mean, there's a reason why they're adding some other veteran center depth.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they're looking at, maybe if he blows them away in training camp, everything goes great. And by, September 25th, October 1st, whatever, his shoulder feels great and he's lighting it up in the preseason. Great, fine. They'll make that adjustment. They'll be more than happy to push Frost onto the opening night roster. But right now, I think that they're saying he might not be ready. And obviously the Phantoms are there for him. And now, I haven't seen him since, he played for the Phantoms 2 seasons ago, and he was a little up and down, not from the Phantoms to the Flyers, and also up and down within his season. He had some slumps in there with the Phantoms where, he's the first one to say, I've got to be better. The defense being what it is, and, moving his feet and getting to the right spots. Like, when he's got the puck on his stick, he's dynamic and exciting. What is he going to do when the puck's not on his stick? Because it's not always going to be on his stick. And, we need a guy. You're an NHL center. The center's got to be defensively responsible.
Of course.
A third line guy has to be. I think. 100%. And that's a concern with Frost's game, and he knows it. And so I don't know what to think on Morgan Frost. The ceiling is so high.
Yeah.
Right. We know what the ceiling is. We can see some of the goals that he can score, and they're just spectacular. Some of the things that he's able to do. But I wish there could be a more complete game. I wish we could get a little more Scott Lawton into Morgan Frost.
Well, Scott Lawton
really get him.
No, I totally agree. But Scott Lawton also had his, up and down journey into the NHL. And that was a guy who was...
yes, but the two-way game was there. I mean, even with the Phantoms in 2014-15, and Terry Murray was our coach then.
That's true.
We're all talking about his 200-foot game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why he was drafted. He was like a Mike Richards light. That's how I always kind of saw him.
Yeah, sure. And he had he was tied for the league lead in shorthanded goals one season, 16, 17, something like that. Yeah, and he had it, but yes, he had an up and down journey, but his 200-foot game was there, and without the dynamic playmaking, of Frost. So that, but yes, obviously he had to grow into it. Frost might have to grow into it some, but I mean, obviously they want him to be there. If he's ready, then they're going to want to get him up there as soon as possible. I don't know if he's healthy though.
I think that's
just
a great
based
point.
on what he said.
Yeah.
So October, I don't know. I'm thinking it would be more likely that he comes to the Phantoms, but I've learned to never take anything to the bank in terms of roster projections or anything like that. It was just a couple of years ago. If you had asked me about the roster going in, we could have talked about all sorts of different players, and I never would have referenced, Carson Chorinsky and Connor Bunnaman are a couple of dark horse candidates. Yeah. And then they make the opening night roster, and kudos to them. And they were coming off of strong seasons with the Phantoms, but I didn't think either of those guys were ready to make the opening night roster with the Flyers. I didn't think that was actually on the table, but they did so well in training camp, and obviously
I think that's why Derek Brassard is here. Well, I think that's why Derek Brassard is here and Nate Thompson, is to make sure that this team doesn't force some of these guys to come into the NHL earlier than they're really supposed to, especially if you want to be a true contender.
Yeah. And Fletcher's been talking about that.
Yeah.
Like I think we're putting our young guys into spots that we were hoping and projecting they might be ready for. And then you find out the hard way, maybe they're not. Maybe it's asking a little bit too much. And so you're kind of going, the opposite way of Ron Hextall, was I don't even think that his rep is deserved, but he had the rep of holding guys back and frustrating fans. And I'm like, I'm watching these guys here. I don't think some of them were ready either.
I don't think Hextall. I loved Ron Hextall. I think his problems were communication.
But that was the rep, obviously.
Yeah. So absolutely. And we'll see what he does with the Penguins. So let's keep it rolling. This is a guy actually I don't want to. I'm going to touch back on the offensive players, but I want to go to Igor Zamula because this is a guy who's highly touted. I personally don't think he's ready for the NHL. He didn't do much statistically for the Phantoms last year. I think they're probably going to wait until he flourishes more offensively in the AHL. And I do think Cam York is ahead of him. I think he's just a more polished player overall and has a higher ceiling. But I'm very interested in Zamula. I remember when he tried out for the Flyers years ago, incredibly poised for a young defenseman.
Yeah.
Obviously has the size, the skating, he has an offensive touch. What do you think about Zamula? What do you see his role with the Phantoms this year?
I agree with you. I don't think he's quite ready yet, and he had some injury issues off and on last year, and he had the back stuff the year before. I'm getting it all, after
I'm getting mixed up.
he had the great World Juniors performance with Russia.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's got a couple of things that have been dogging him for a little while, but he's exciting, and the guy can skate, and I mean, some of the moves that he makes when he's on the power play and there's this spin or back skating thing, I'm just laughing because it's just so ludicrous how good it is, and how good he is in his stride and just flying past everyone. And I think it was his last game before he took an injury on a blocked shot that kept him out for 3 weeks, and it was earlier in the game, and he's just carrying up ice on a penalty kill, I think it was. And, he sees a little bit of an opening. He just burns right past him and turns it into a shorthanded breakaway. He gets a penalty shot out of it. He didn't score, and I'm like I'm waiting for the numbers to come. When is he going to score a goal, for crying out loud? Like, seriously, because he's got a good heavy shot too. But he made some guys look pretty foolish, and he does. And the comparisons with Phil Myers, I think, are pretty fair.
Yeah.
I mean, because I see a lot, Phil's right-handed, but I see a lot of similarities, and it's impossible not to. He's a big guy who can skate like the wind, who was also a non-drafted pickup who has all this potential, and you look at him and go, how on earth was he not drafted? It doesn't even make sense. Like, he's, but guys are late bloomers. I think there's, and I think he's pretty smart. I saw the adjustments that he was making in his game from the first, couple of weeks of the season to where, he ended up going later on, and poise and doesn't panic. And, I don't think you're really going to rattle him mentally, which I think is maybe more important than maybe some people realize, or maybe I realize. The poise, as well as the skill and the smarts and the hockey vision, everything that he can do. And on top of that, now, you'll learn by observation, not just in the room, but on the ice as well. And he sees some of the things that Cam York does, and you can do kind of a poor man's imitation of some of those things. And York can kind of learn on some of the ideas from Zamula, which I think Cam York was kind of talking about a little bit, because they really have very different games. They complement each other, but you can also kind of learn a little bit. York can be that playmaker. Z can do a little bit of that, and he can step up there, kind of like what we would get out of Phil Myers sometimes with the Phantoms as well, sometimes a little too much. I think Zamula's got a terrifically bright future. I have to think, I don't know when he goes back up there again. I think he was okay when he went up to the Flyers for whatever it was, his 2 games last year. And, maybe he wasn't all the way ready for that, but it was fine.
The coaching staff
he's
clearly
absolutely going to be knocking on the door. What's that?
Yeah. I was saying the coaching staff clearly likes him. I mean, without a doubt.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and with good reason.
Yeah.
And yeah, now they're, without Phil Myers, they have too many lefties, but which I think they can survive. But Z, I think the sky's the limit for him. I think he can be a really good NHL defenseman for a really long time.
Excellent. Great breakdown. So let me jump to another young guy. I don't think we mentioned him earlier. This is a player who I think will make the NHL earlier than most people anticipated. I'm not saying he's going to make it this year, but I think anybody who's got an elite skill set the way he does, the fact that he has NHL size and the fact that he's already outperformed his pace that was expected in the AHL, just like Zayd Wisdom kind of coming in and making a big impact and improving as the season went on. That's Tyson Forrester. I think this is a guy who, even when he was drafted, I think the expectations weren't as high as they're kind of building to right now. This is a guy with an elite NHL shot. I think Allison also has a great shot. He's ahead of him, obviously, for various reasons, deservedly, and I think Allison will probably make the NHL, if not at camp, at some point during the season. I think he looks fantastic. But I think Tyson Forrester is a very interesting player, and I think one that could develop into a serious top 6 player in the NHL. How do you see Tyson Forrester, and how do you think about his previous year?
Yes, and I agree. I think he's legit. And last year, right from game 1, and then he got injured in the first game, and then he comes back. He had a fractured shin. A Hershey player crashed out and kind of took his legs out from underneath him. And he was having a great game too. And Tyson will say that I was having a good game, for my pro debut. And then, comes back a month later, and it took him a couple of weeks to kind of grow back into it some. But overall, what Forster showed last season was way beyond what I was expecting out of him. I'm looking at a 19-year-old kid that's coming in from the OHL. I expect him to be a little soft, a little irresponsible, defending or handling the puck. He's a smart player. And that was kind of what I was, I got that out of a couple of the other players as well. Actually, I didn't even get it out of them. They just sort of offered it. And there was a guy that we had, defenseman Derek Couliot on our team.
Sure.
This is a former first round. Yep. And Scott Gordon had talked about some of this as well. The first rounders today are, and the major juniors guys today with Wisdom, who was a 4th rounder.
Yeah.
That coming in, they're smarter, they're in better shape, and they're more ready, just in terms of intelligence and knowledge and being able to pick up on systems and so forth, way more so than juniors guys and young guys were 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And Scott Gordon said that like 5 years ago. And I had to kind of double back as he kind of, slid that in there, like he sometimes had a habit of doing. I'm like, hang on a minute here, let's go back there. You said just 5 years ago and the players are better. And Scott's like, I know, but I'm telling you, the difference is noticeable because you get these guys at the end of the season on the ATOs and the 18 and 19-year-olds that would show up. And they're not ready. They don't look like they, can really play for the most part. I mean, sometimes they can, but they look like they're guys on tryout contracts. And the guys today are different, which I think has some relevance in terms of discussion of the NHL CHL agreement and whether we should be getting some of these 18 and 19-year-old kids in the AHL more regularly, because last year was kind of the test run for that. And what we saw with Forster and Zayd Wisdom, who absolutely was way better than I ever expected him to be. And I think he was better than the Flyers expected him to be, or that Scott Gordon expected him to be, or maybe, I think it's probably correct, more than Zayd Wisdom himself expected himself to be, because he's going into this whole situation. And I talked to them about it too. He's going into this situation with grownups, guys that have kids. I mean, big guys that, now, I mean, because he's used to being the muscle guy, sure. Now he's with a bunch of other, grownups. Is he just going to fall flat on his face? Can he skate with these guys? He was with the Kingston Frontenacs playing against a bunch of 17-year-olds. I mean, that's different. And I know that he impressed himself. I don't know if Forster had one thought or the other. I mean, I think they both kind of came into this and went, boy, I hope I'm okay at this. But, Forster, I think, has got that. Wisdom's a confident kid, too. Maybe he was a little more honest about it. Forster, you just sort of get the impression, well, I'm going to show up, I'm going to play, I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to score some goals. And, and once his skating gets there a little bit, and I know they're working on that, I think he's got a terrific ceiling. And I didn't know much about him. I mean, a guy that's, okay, he's got a big shot, he can score goals in major juniors. Yippee, there are a lot of guys that have a big shot that can score goals against 18-year-old goalies in major juniors. But Forster showed up, and, I mean, he not only played as well as his teammates or opponents, but he was better than most of them, when nobody I think was really expecting him to be as good and as smart as he was. So it's beyond the skill set. It's his vision on the ice and his smarts to see what's happening and see the plays in front of him, and he's, he passes up shots sometimes. I mean, he wasn't just a shooting machine. I love him. I didn't expect to. I thought this is going to be a little rough for these new guys who are probably too young to be here.
Right.
I think that was a really common perception for a lot of the major juniors guys all over the league. Sure. And, we had the 2 kids from the OHL, and, and you compare that with a different guy who really was maybe not quite ready for it, a guy like Mason Millman, who I think would have been better off going back to major juniors. He's just a little thin, and he get pushed around some. I mean, he was okay, but there's a lot to learn, which is fine. It's okay to not fully be ready for pro hockey against 25-year-olds when you're 18 and you've just been drafted, and it's 100%. Such a gigantic step. Yeah. Millman was, he did what he hung in there, but he certainly didn't thrive. I think he got better as the season progressed when he got his opportunities. But Forrester and Wisdom, I mean, right from week 1, week 2, you're like, this is no accident. These guys are on top of it, and they're smart. And that's what I saw, and that's what I got out of Derek Couliot in that one quote, and Scott Gordon, and somebody else was telling me that as well. That it's just amazing the difference for some of these young players compared to young players jumping into the pro game 5 or 10 years ago. And Couliot said it too, and without me saying anything, it's just like I couldn't do what these kids were doing when I first turned pro. Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't happen, but now it is happening.
Very noticeable.
It's interesting, and it goes to their level of instruction that that they're getting, all the way up through their game into, all the way before major juniors and Bantams and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I like to talk about the US and NTDP, right? That US program.
Yeah.
You look at the players that come out of there; they act like adults, like they're 18 years old. I mean, I talk about Joel Farabee. I was not shocked at all at the progress that he made. I was talking about him making camp 24 months before he did, because I was just like, I just saw the character. I got to be around him a little bit, and I just saw the way he spoke. That's why I talk so highly about Cam York as well. You get to see him in the drills. They act like pros. They're 18 years old, and they're acting like they're 24, 25 years old. It's just so rare to see.
No, I said the same thing about Farabee, the maturity and the composure. And he's not the only one that I thought that about, but I'm like, he's 19 years old when we had him with the Phantoms. Like, really? I kind of have to remind myself.
Very skinny, right? Didn't
right. Yeah. But he's got that kind of composure. And, I don't know.
Work ethic too, though, right? Because you look at the progress that he made in 1 year, especially in comparison to other young players. Like I was going to say, I'm not so sure that that's necessarily related to the National Development Program, but when you think about it more and how much those guys push each other, because you're fighting for playing time against all the best players in the country. Yeah, they were dominant.
And so, I mean, it's a different situation than when you're, I mean, there was talent at Michigan where Cam York was, but he's very obviously, one of the best players in the country, on a team where not everybody is really up to his caliber. But on the national team and the Olympic or the World Juniors team, when he's there, now everyone's, a lot closer to his status and his level and his abilities. So, I mean, I guess I can see that playing in. But yes, I agree with what you're saying about Farabee and his personality is really, has that character and composure, which it is important. I mean, I don't know how better to explain it to fans, or like, well, I mean, character and composure aren't going to be enough to get you to the NHL. But, the fact is, it kind of is. You need the skill and the ability also, but, it really does make a difference.
Yeah, no, immensely. And actually, you mentioned Bunnaman Twarensky. I actually guessed that Twarensky was going to make it. I didn't think Bunnaman was going to make it because he plays center. The reason I guessed Twarensky, I had a chance.
You guessed him during camp because he was
he
was making waves. But going into camp, he's not your dark horse guy.
No, absolutely not. Well, actually, what happened was,
I'm talking about. We are before training camp, and 2 years ago at this time, when we're projecting the Flyers roster, neither one of us or anyone else are talking about Bunnaman and Twarensky.
No. Well, so this is what happened, is that I had a chance to interview Twarensky. And I remember I asked him, just a simple question. One, I got to stand in front of him, right? And I just saw physically that he was physically was ready. And then I asked him what his role was. Like, what do you see your role as an NHL player? And he just looked at me, he smirked, and he said, NHL grinder. He didn't say, I want to score goals. He didn't say, he just looked at me. He's like, I know exactly what I'm here to do. And again, I was just guessing. I could have absolutely been wrong, but I was kind of like, just the way he was built and the fact that he almost was like tailoring his game for the role that was available, that I was like, I feel like he has a chance. And though I completely agree with you, you wouldn't look at Twarynski prior to that, right? Like even a month before then, be like, oh, that's going to be the guy that's going to make it. But there's a level of maturity to understand where you are and the physicality you have to put into the game. And I think that's what coaches look for. I think they look for little details like that too.
Yeah. I mean, I think these guys know, what they are and what their game's about. Bunneman did he have 20 goals with us as a rookie? I mean, he was really kind of a surprise.
Yeah,
20,
awesome.
Yeah, and
awesome
they were all,
start.
Almost all of them were within 5 feet of the goalie. You get in there on the power play and just get rebounds and, whatever greasy goals, and they'd laugh about them like, and I'm right there to score again. Like, they're not pretty, but and he's a guy where, he had some chances there with the Flyers, but I feel like the kind of herky-jerky scheduling there and going to the taxi squad and all of that stuff.
It's tough.
It's tough, and for Twarynski too. It came down
100%.
to us for a couple of games. I don't know, and I'm, we can't do that again because it's not fair to those players, and some are going to be affected by it differently than others. Sure. So here's a guy that, and I don't know if Bunneman's really, he's going to try to push his way onto the opening night roster again. And I mean, it's sort of similar to 2 years ago. Everyone's talking about, the other centers,
sure,
and Broussard and Thompson and Morgan Frost and all those guys jumbled around. And Connor Bunneman's going to try to go in there and crash the party, not unlike what he did 2 years ago. I don't know if he does that out of this training camp or not, but here's a guy that once he gets the regular reps again, because once he came down to the Phantoms, his game wasn't what it was, when that got him up to the Flyers in the first place. But in so many different ways that season, you can't read too much into it because it's just, and Chuck Fletcher even would mention that about the Flyers in general and the different COVID interruptions. Okay, well, other teams had COVID interruptions too. Well, guess what? Buffalo wasn't as bad as their 18-game losing streak. They just weren't. But they had a long COVID layoff also, which just killed them. And once you get a little bit into your depth and your goaltending's a little off, or your defense is not clicking, or you're relying on your youth, and you throw in a COVID layoff, there's some teams, and New Jersey, had their struggles too. There were some real issues there that are related to that, where you're looking at that season going, we might have been able to hang in there, but after the COVID, we just weren't the same team.
Sure.
After they had that long layoff and they were kind of pushed into returning into that outdoor game in Lake Tahoe and all that, right. So anyway, I kind of looked at Bunneman's season last year as being kind of related to that as well. I didn't talk with him about it, but I have to think that he was a little disappointed that he wasn't able to stick in the NHL. That's where he wants to be. And I don't think that his performance with the Phantoms was really up to his standard, and certainly not the same that we saw out of him a couple of years ago. So sort of similar to Ratcliffe with some different variables thrown in there. I can see Connor Bunneman, getting back to that game. I'm going to assume that he, was working out hard this summer and is ready to hit the ground running when he shows up at camp. That's going to be a guy that's interesting to see too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you might be right. He might surprise everybody again, right? He did it once. Right. Actually, he did it twice, I would argue.
When was I don't know all the details here, but I'm kind of like, when was the last time the Flyers had a training camp where they came out of the camp without somebody getting injured?
Or every time.
You can look at your lineup now, but guys get hurt in camp too. And that, obviously that's why you have the depth in the first place.
Chuck Fletcher was asked, I forget the interview, but he was asked a great question. And I'm sorry to whoever asked the question. Maybe it was Jordan Hall, but I don't remember exactly. But he asked a great question. How many defensemen do you think you need in an NHL season? And you thought his answer was going to be 8, and he's like, at least 10. And in his
Oh
mind,
yeah,
they're preparing for a long season. They're not
right.
preparing for that optimal day one. Here are all my, here's my paper and I put all the names down. They're like, okay, so if we lose an entire line, who can we throw in there? If we're down to 4 defensemen, who can we call up? Right? It's really those scenarios that you have to prepare for.
Well, yeah. I mean, sometimes we'll go an entire season or most of a season without any call ups at all for defensemen because somehow they all are more or less staying healthy. And
I've seen
then
that too.
other times you're dropping like flies. And obviously, a couple of years ago, I mean, they had 8 goalies for Pete's sakes. I mean,
Don't even remind me. That was a
I mean, you're
nightmare.
just grabbing, Mike
Yeah.
McKenna and everybody else, every and any goalie that you can get your hands on to get thrown in there, and because Carter Hart was in and out a little bit, and and that well he came up midway through that season because that was when Hackstall got let go and then
Sure.
Scott
Yeah.
Gordon came in, and then Carter Hart went in. I mean, just and we had a season maybe a few years ago because it was Adirondack, and by the end of the year, and the Flyers were out of the playoffs. It might have been 2013-14. The defense for Philadelphia, it was like 5 Adirondack guys from just a few weeks ago or earlier, and I don't remember everyone who got injured or what happened there, but Oliver Lordson and Matt Conan, who played 2 NHL games, and all of these guys going up, and I'm like, this is it's the Phantoms defense.
Yeah.
And it was garbage games at the end of the year, so it ended up being nice opportunities for these guys, but it was like, it was crazy. It was one after another. And then, with Adirondack, we're just grabbing all these. We had some tryout guys, amateur tryout guys from major juniors, and just grabbing whoever we could from the ECHL to make it work. That's the grind of a hockey season. You can look at your stars, but it's the depth that gets you there. Can your 9th and 10th defenseman carry it some as well? And here, you're at the tail end of that. You've got the prospects like York and Zamula who could be ready now or soon. Right. You've got some exciting talent there who are on the verge of stepping in if something happens or if somebody is underperforming and they end up looking ready, which also ends up, could be a possibility as well. I mean, you had sort of the situation with Eric Gustafson, who did not perform up to expectations last year.
Yeah, well, nobody did at that point.
So, I mean, you're prepared for all these different contingencies, but no, I wouldn't have expected Chuck to say 8. I mean, yeah, you need 10, 12 to get through a season, and we have a little bit of the same here with Lehigh Valley as well. We'll have 8 or 9 guys that are kind of earmarked. Then you get down to 10. I mean, guys that I see here in the preseason that'll go down to Reading of the ECHL, and more often than not, you're going to see them coming back to Lehigh Valley in December or January. We got a double hit here. If we get an injury with the Phantoms, then we got to bring in one of our depth guys or call up somebody from Reading. So that's part one. But if the Flyers get an injury, then we're losing a guy to a call up, and we're going to have to fill that spot as well. So we end up getting our own injuries and getting affected by Flyers injuries. So it's a double whammy for these teams in the AHL. And so we're used to it. We're used to, you think the roster shuffling gets crazy with the Flyers. It's even crazier here because it's like, well, we got 3 guys that were called up last week and 2 other guys that blocked shots, and they're all out at the same time. So now he brought up 5 Reading Royals guys. And now Reading's going, what do we do? We're putting our forwards back on D because we're running out of players. That happens all the time.
Well, that's the grind of the season. Depth wins championships.
Good times, yes.
No, it's 100% true. A lot of times when you see the teams that are the best teams in the league, you look at their minor league affiliate and they're also good. It's very rare that, championship teams don't have a good minor league affiliate. It's just, you don't normally see that, especially ones that are competitive year after year. It's usually a full, 50-team roster, right? 50-player roster that really wins you a championship, not just those peak players at the top. So I completely agree.
Well, and now the Phantoms players, I think, they've already been shown to be, ready to step in, but there's been a bit of a point of emphasis that, Lappy is going to be running the same systems all through
Yep.
the Phantoms that are already with the
So they're
Flyers.
ready
And
for
I mean,
that.
when a guy would get called up, he'd have to kind of, learn it when he'd get up there. And, Lappy would oftentimes be the guy to sit down with him at a laptop and a whiteboard. And, okay, well, I know your breakout with the Phantoms was this, but here, we're going the other
Now
way.
it's going to be the same, right? Or
Right.
similar.
Now it's going to be the same. And that consistency,
It's huge.
that's what more teams are growing towards from the AHL to the NHL level. And so the breakouts that we have, or what, and other structures on the power play and so forth, maybe it's not tailor suited to the players that we have on our team. So now you're plugging in pieces for a power play that is the Flyers power play. It's not our power play, or maybe, okay, that doesn't work as well for us because we don't have the same kind of bodies or the same kind of talent in the different spots. But you're going to do it the same way anyway, so that when whoever gets called up, they're going right out. They go on the ice and there's no learning curve. Oh, this is exactly what I was doing there. And that kind of consistency and synergy from the NHL to the AHL with the systems, I think, is considered vitally important today for more and more organizations. Not everyone is patterning. I mean, you want to teach players to win, and sometimes that means deviating and finding the system that works best for your team. But I think it's what the Flyers are looking for as well, significantly so.
100%. I totally agree with that. That was my thought process months ago when they kind of made that decision, and I think it's a very wise one. And it'll save a lot of time and energy kind of transitioning players. So we've done 90 minutes here, so we went way over. I told you we go over.
No way, really? Oh my God.
It always happens. But
sorry.
No. I love it. I
had no idea.
It's all right. I don't want to stop talking. That's always my problem too. So, as we check off here, I think we talked about a lot of awesome topics, but you're gearing up for the season. Anything anybody should know about it? Are you working on anything personal? Maybe, how people can follow you. Obviously you have great tweets online. I follow your tweets all the time. Just anything you want to give the audience on your way out.
We just had a message to our social media saying, hey, how can I watch the Phantoms this season? I'm like, I don't know how you wouldn't know necessarily, but I guess people don't know. But I mean, locally, it's not even my broadcast, but locally, it's on TV on Service Electric Television. There's some other announcers there, and they do a fine job with Stephen Swaively and Steve Dagler, who I was talking about earlier. Yeah. But as you mentioned, the games are also on the internet package from AHL TV. Yep. And AHLTV.com. And that's, I mean, if we have Morgan Frost and Cam York here, I mean, it's pretty cool keeping up with and keeping tabs on those guys. Right. And then we have the Phantom 365 app, which is my radio broadcast. If you're not going to pay it's a pay-per-view season. It's actually pretty cheap on AHL TV to get the season package. And it's pretty good. And,
like
seeing us
$50 for all the Phantoms games or something?
Yeah, $60 for the season. Yeah, something like that. I don't know. And
not bad at all.
I mean, what I'm looking forward to among other aspects this season. I mean, we got playoffs again. We have a real season instead of kind of that weird year last year. We had these postponements that were never made up, and we didn't have playoffs. I mean, this was kind of a prospects league, a prospect season. Just get the games in, and the fact that we actually got from the beginning to the end of the season at all, the fact that they played the season at all in the first place, and we began with 50 fans.
It was a big win.
Yeah, I didn't expect it, because a year before, the AHL CEO at the time, Dave Andrews, was talking about it and like, well, I mean, I think we need to have at least 50% capacity to be able to make it work, because it's a ticket-driven league, and we can't just play games and have our teams lose money. And then the Board of Governors, when COVID was kind of going a little longer than maybe some were thinking it was going to, and they got together and said, you know what, we can lose money. This is too important. We'll go out there, we'll play these games. We're going to get hit in the pocketbook, but it's too important to keep this going, because they didn't have to play the NHL season. They could have kept, the prospects and Igor Zamula and whoever else could have kept them in Voorhees and played prospects games at the practice rinks. And they could have just done it that way. They didn't have to send them to AHL.
Right.
I think they felt it was important to be in in the AHL environment and do it this way. But if the AHL had said, well, we can't do it because we're going to lose money, which is what a lot of people thought was going to happen, the NHL would have found a different way to get games for their guys. The fact that they actually had this season, I thought was a terrific triumph, and kind of surprised me from what I thought was going to end up happening. You had asked me in October, November, how are we going to do this? I mean, the teams aren't going to, go out there and lose money. They did.
They did.
They went out there and they lost money to make this work. And we only played the 3 opponents. So, I mean, it was kind of easier travel, but we avoided the hotel stays.
Yeah.
And so this year we go to all the other opponents. We go and play in Providence, Rhode Island against the Providence Bruins. And, theoretically, and I'm hoping this still, and down to Charlotte too, which is now the Florida and Seattle combined affiliate. I'm hoping we have Canada teams on the schedule. So we're going to go to the Toronto Marlies and Laval Rocket and Belleville Senators. We're supposed to anyway. I don't take that to the bank with whatever issues we have with the border. So the fact that we actually have a real season with, more than just 3 opponents, and we're going to have playoffs again, which I think, guys care about that.
It's huge.
And getting back to something that's at least a lot closer to normal, because when we started in February, and I'm calling games in all these empty arenas or with 500 fans that they had at a couple places and completely empty in Newark and Wilkes-Barre and pretty empty in our place. That was weird. So I'm just looking forward to it being a bit less weird and a bit more normal this year. And so anyway, I'm on the app and on AHL TV, and that I do some of the media relations stuff too. Yep. So, I'm throwing some game recaps and whatever other notes that I can think of on our website. And, I'm out there, I'm around. It's my 12th, 13th year, 12th year with the Phantom. So, and it's a month away. So let's do this.
It's awesome. So yeah, make sure to check out AHL.tv and sign up. Support the team. You're missing out on games. You're talking about all these prospects. You want to see them. They're actually playing hockey. You don't have to just look at their statistics. So definitely make sure you check it out and make sure you follow Bob online. Bob, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you coming on. I'm going to have you back on sometime in the near future.
At any time. Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please subscribe, hit that like button on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to if you follow us on Spotify or iTunes, everything. Obviously, I'm available on everything. And check out the team store, follow Jamie, and share our stuff out if you can. That's a humongous help. It's always a humongous help. Get geared up for the season. I'm excited. Bob's obviously excited as well. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And remember to always stay